Chapter 1. The Visitor. Nathan remembered the figure standing in the doorway, the light at his back, his face dark, the line of the horizon behind his knees. He remembered white towers of clouds resting on the blue bed of the sea, his parents' faces, drawn with worry, resignation, or was it the shame of their humble fisher's hut before this powerful foreign visitor? The nets drying on the wall, the cries of seagulls, the tinkle of the wind chime fashioned from seashells, even the first words of the foreign man as he stood in the doorway, all were still so clear in his mind. "Is this the boy?" the visitor asked, dispensing with any greeting, introduction, or other pleasantries. Nathan remembered this slight to his people, his parents, even if he could not remember their names. Nathan had had a name, a full one, first and surname, that day the visitor came to take him away. He was sure his parents had given both to him. Every child received both on their name day, and he was far beyond his name day when the visitor came. The fact that he had memory of that last day with his parents was proof enough, but his surname had slipped away along with so much else, like dreams upon waking, or a ghost seen out of the corner of the eye. Once glimpsed, it was elusive. The visitor was accompanied by the chief. Nathan had forgotten the chief's name as well, but his face, round, crowned by a balding pate, was long familiar to him, and his presence was a comfort that morning when the visitor came. Nathan's own parents waited at his back, his mother's hand possessively on his shoulder. His father was left to answer the visitor's question. "Yes, this is our boy." A silent pause followed, wherein the visitor waited without moving. Nathan's father cleared his throat as if to speak, but before he could, the chief nodded and gestured to the bare table waiting in the center of the room. "You may begin," the chief said. His father acquiesced, opening and closing cabinets with gentle efficiency. He gathered a bowl, a spoon, a spool of fishing line from the corners of the room, and placed them on the table. "Go ahead," the chief said with a tentative smile. Nathan felt his mother's hand on his shoulder. For a moment, he was confused whether to act or not. He understood what was wanted, but it had been so hard to tell when to move things without touching them, and when it was forbidden. The power had always been in him, but often his parents had reprimanded him for using it. He'd never forget the flash of terror on their faces when he had sent a bowl of gruel across the room, or a sweet zipping to his fingers at a whim. "It's all right, Nathan," he heard his father say. And so he did. Nathan began with the spoon, lifting it up on its end. He turned it. It was difficult to see the face of the visitor, for he still stood silhouetted against the doorway, but he did not gasp, cower, or make a sign to avert evil. Quite the contrary, he did nothing, as if what he witnessed was ordinary and mundane. Nathan felt more confident. He placed the spoon down and lifted the bowl into the air, levitating it in the middle space between ceiling and table. Now the stranger moved, reaching up to the bowl to pinch it and set it spinning. The sensation of dizziness that emerged in Nathan's mind surprised him. Uncomfortable, he willed the bowl to slow, and it did. "Good," the visitor said, now taking control of the proceedings. "The spool." Nathan obeyed, concentrating on the spool, turning it on its side and unraveling the fishing line. As it collected in a pile, he thought he heard his mother choke back a sob. The visitor put his hand up, signaling for Nathan to stop. He did. "Tie it." This was novel. Someone who was not only unafraid of Nathan's abilities, but wanted to explore them. Nathan studied his father and mother, unsure as how to respond. He looked down, scrutinizing the laces of his own boots, and swallowed. "He cannot tie it," his mother said, her voice thick with emotion. I still tie his boots for him." "He is very young," the chief said. The visitor nodded, pushed his cloak over his shoulder and strode across the room, pulled a candle from its stick, and pressed its end down onto the table so it balanced there amid the spoon, bowl, and unfurled fishing line. "Light it," the visitor said. He might as well have asked Nathan to tie the line again. He was not allowed to play with fire. So many times he had been admonished to remain clear of candles and the cooking fire. But now Nathan was curious. Was this something he could accomplish with his mind? Not alone, he knew, out of some unnameable instinct. Instead, Nathan lifted his hand, reaching for the candle, but stopping well short of it. He concentrated on the wick, blackened, cold, and bent, imagining a blade of light balanced on it. He imagined heat, burning even. The tips of his fingers felt warm. He moved with the sensation, almost like balancing a drop of water on the pads of his fingers, until it felt most intense between thumb and forefinger. His digits became rigid, just as a string of smoke twisted into the air above the candle, a speck of orange glowing on it like a tiny star. A seagull cried, as if to remark upon the breeze that had inexplicably grown weaker. There was a soft flutter, like a butterfly beating its wings, and the flame was suddenly there, burning merrily, cutting into the darkness. Nathan dropped his hand, aware of how stiff his muscles had become, and shook out his arm. His father's and the chief's eyes were wide and lidless. It was the look of alarm he was accustomed to when he used his powers. His mother's fist was against her mouth, her eyes shut tight. "I've seen enough," the visitor said. "Have him sent to my ship. He is not meant for this place. Where I take him, he will be safe." "Praise be," his father whispered. His mother sobbed. As if eager to be done with the place, people, and the whole business, the visitor turned on his heel and stepped out into the sunlight. The chief reached under his jerkin and produced a bag that jingled with the sound of coins. His eyes, brows, and mouth all seemed to bend with a sympathetic frown. His mother wept aloud now and reached out to clutch Nathan, but his father drew her hand away to his chest, wearing the same sad expression as the chief. The chief swept Nathan up from the floor into his arms and carried him to the door. Something was terribly wrong with it all. Nathan cried out, "Mama!" But at the sound of his voice, his mother convulsed, burying her face deeper into his father's shoulder. His father took one last look at him, his eyes glistening in the light of the candle on the table, and said, "Go." Nathan cried out, fighting against the chief, this man he knew to be gentle and kind, so he felt no fear in striking him and struggling against him. But the strength of an adult was absolute, and although Nathan screamed, reaching for the hut as it receded from his outstretched hand, the chief did not waver. Instead, he made a shushing sound, much like the sound of the waves that was ever present on the island. "Remember, Nathan. Remember all of this." Nathan. That was his name. He remembered that, at least. He tried to remember the other details, the loaf-shaped stones of the hut, the thatch roof, the pen for animals, the racks of drying fish, the bright green grass growing at the edge of the path. Gulls wheeled in the breeze, and terns nestled in the eaves of the huts they passed. A woman's hand closed the shutter in a window. The ship was larger than any fishing skiff Nathan had ever seen before. Previously, he had not been allowed on boats, even though he watched his father and other men of the village sail out each morning for the early catch, too many times to count. This boat had high sides and a wide, flat floor like a house, uninterrupted by thwarts. Fierce-looking men stood by awaiting orders that came from the visitor himself, who barked them out over his shoulder as he walked back to his cabin. The chief put Nathan down on the deck, said a blessing over him, then scrambled for the gangway, his head held low. Nathan did not like to remember what followed. Days of crying, weeping, calling out for his parents, asking when he would return home. This sadness accompanied by a seasickness that reduced him to a soiled mess on the boards of the deck. The sailors mostly ignored him. He was only quiet when he was too weak from hunger and thirst to continue. It was then that the visitor reemerged from his cabin, knelt down beside him, and offered him a cup of water and biscuits. Nathan took them without thanks, and while he ate, the man, his face visible for the first time, stared at him with deep-set, pale eyes, and said in a firm voice, "From now on, your name is Gregor." This man had given him food and water. This man was the only person he knew on the boat. He, Gregor, not Nathan, decided not to argue. But he did muster the temerity to ask, "What do I call you?" "You, Gregor, will call me Master." Chapter 2. Karrith. Haille thought he had left the demons behind in Sidon, where the bodiless shadows had tormented him and his friends. But now he knew better. Now he knew his inner turmoil could be as much a beast as a wolf in a cage, or an undead shadow in a haunted forest. So he ran. Otherwise he would sit in darkness, his own thoughts torture to him. He yearned for oblivion, and only in the exhaustion of running through streets in the small hours of the night could he find it. In daylight, he shut himself away behind locked doors, drawn curtains, and clenched eyelids. Even in that darkness, there was no comfort from the endless images replaying themselves in his dreams. His father wounded, coughing up blood so that drops caught on his lips and chin, like an old man dribbling some heinous meal down his face. But his father was not yet old, and what a catastrophe to die before then, to die at all. King Telemar's once bright eyes mere shadows, the color draining from his face, and his breath smelling of copper, a smell Haille could only associate with a butchery. And then his father's last words, "Erzoli." King Telemar's wife, Antus's queen, Karrith's own daughter, Haille's own mother, whom he took after so much in appearance that strangers who had never met him knew him to be the prince. After so many leagues, fields, forests, and seas, his father never saw him. Instead, Talamar spoke to a phantom of his own sorrow. In the end, Haille had failed. The prophecy from the old woman, Lorna, that his father was in mortal danger was no prophecy, but rather fate. There was no changing it. Haille had been doomed to fail. And so, he ran. He ran so that his muscles burned like acid in a chemist's crucible, his lungs drank fire, and his skin wept salted rivers. The Corinthians left him alone in those first long winter nights, after the battle for their city was over. There were so many madmen and mad women who wandered the streets at odd hours alongside orphaned children, all of them too traumatized by nightmares to sleep. The smell of funeral pyres still hung in their air, an acrid replacement for the foul odor of the bodies that rotted, Anthorian, Corinthian, Morvant, not to mention the horses that had borne men of both sides into battle. Haille ran. He pictured the bones of his frame coming loose from his body, continuing ahead of him, a fleeting figure of death. Could he outrun his own life, his own identity? His feet pounded out a dirge, at a furious pace, but a dirge nonetheless, one that all the other lonely souls of the night understood. Could he outrun his grief, his loss, his failure? On 2 occasions, the exertions caused him to seize, and, for once, he welcomed the unconsciousness, the relief from his own thoughts, and the dreamless sleep that followed as he lay undisturbed in the street, taken for just another drunk. Nights passed. Haille ran. One evening a cat pranced out of his way, startled by his oncoming footfalls. The cat stuck out in his mind, because he had seen so few cats in the days before. So many had been killed and eaten in the city, which had been bursting at the seams with refugees. Gutters overflowed with filth and excrement. On the first few nights, Haille had not known the streets and had fallen into those same gutters and returned to his bedchambers smelling of filth. He had not bothered to wash since, the stench still clinging to him. But cleanliness was for day-dwellers, those people who still celebrated the victory, those people within whom hope had rekindled, those people who had set about rebuilding, rehabilitating, refurbishing. Those people included his friends. How could he explain to them that he felt as if he stared at them from across a river, some tributary demarking the living and the dead, and he was a mistake, in the land of the living, but no longer willing or able to endure? Sadness, failure, loss. His eyes blurred with tears. The torchlights on the walls of the city turned into halos of orange. Fire had saved the castle, or so they said, the Corinthians turning the flaming rampart against the invaders, an avalanche of heat and smoking debris that had turned the tide of battle. His father had done the same at the city gates, serving as the decisive force, the inspiring leader at the time when he was needed most. Haille ran past the portcullis now and heard the voices of soldiers. He could smell the scent of their pipe weed as they smoked to pass the time. He turned up the wide boulevard, the sky behind him lightening. Haille hated these open spaces. He wished to disappear in the maze of side streets, where he could slip behind corners, avoiding the gaze of onlookers. His strength was failing, his throat raw as he turned into a narrow alleyway and splashed through muck. A cock crowed. Morning was not far, and neither was exhaustion and the relief of sleep. Haille came to the manor house that had been granted to him and his friends to stay in after the battle. The sentries knew his habits by now, and offered no salutation as he passed through the front gate into the courtyard. He heard the horses stirring in the stables, huffing and stamping in the cold. He imagined wings of breath spreading from their nostrils. He had to hurry to avoid seeing his friends awake. He slipped off his shoes, his pulse still pounding in his head, stole up the stairs, passing closed doors, before coming to his own, opened it quickly and collapsed on the other side, the curtains already drawn, a chest of drawers standing by, ready to be pulled across the doorway. The first few days they had knocked and called to him, Val, Katlyn, Chloe, Cody, Gunther, but nothing and no one would draw him out. He had let the voices merge with the visions of the battlefield he still saw in his nightmares, where he experienced his father's death over again, the blood on his hands reminiscent of the blood already there from the death of his mother. He was complicit in that death as well, his own birth, his own life, the cause of her demise. So it was with his father, too. Had he not ridden a beast of the same breed that had killed the king, an elk of unknown origin? Together, he and Adamantus had been a force, a thunderbolt rending the Morvant lines apart. Haille and the elk had beaten a course straight for his father's banners. But lo, what waited there but 3 more beasts, these dark and twisted cousins of Adamantus, but elk nonetheless, who had rammed the points of their antlers into his father's broken body. He had failed. Not only that, Haille was guilty. To what extent he was not sure, but perhaps it did not matter. Adamantus had fled with the Morvant. What more obvious sign was there of the elk's own guilt? Now Haille felt his own life was forfeit. What would the world care if he died at 16 or 86? Perhaps justice would call for his death sooner rather than later. Perhaps then all would be righted with the world. So when the banging grew so loud that it woke him, and the Corinthian soldiers stormed in and opened the curtains, the unwelcome light burning his eyes and reflecting off their drawn blades and polished armor, he did not resist. "In the name of King Owain of Karrith, we place you under arrest," their captain said. Val, Chloe, Cody, and even Katlyn had followed them in, the concern on their faces obvious, Katlyn's eye gleaming with tears to see how thin Haille had become over these days of self-imposed isolation. "On what charges?" Val said, moving between Haille and the captain. "Regicide," the captain answered. Haille, surprisingly, felt no reaction whatsoever, even if his friends appeared confounded. Chloe and Cody's hands moved towards their swords. He had learned to read them well over the past weeks and knew they were ready for a fight, but he wanted no more bloodshed. He got up from his bed, slipped on the trousers that were sizes too big for him, and offered his wrists to the nearest soldier, who clamped shackles around them. At least the dungeon would offer some darkness. Chapter 3. Trial. The court chamber was a pit, a circular amphitheater in the bowels of the castle. It was deeper than it was wide, with rows of seating, one row teetering just above the next. This carried the sound of the proceedings, but, more strikingly, resulted in the accused appearing to sink into a hole, while rows of eyes looked down in judgment. The judge waiting on a dais was none other than King Owain himself. He was hoary with age, his long hair and beard gone white and clasped in tarnished brass bands. His skin was red, his eyes rheumy and opaque. The years had bent his spine so that he sat hunched, glowering out under bushy eyebrows. He wore no crown except for a silver circlet. A blue stone set in a necklace rested against his chest. Its brightness was a contrast to his snowy beard, and it peered out like an unblinking, watchful eye. No wonder he had called upon Talamar for help repelling the hordes of Morvant, Katlyn thought to herself. Old as he was, Owain could have never led a charge against the sieging forces. Otherwise, she had only heard praise for the king of Karrith. He was called wise and beneficent by his people. Talamar had looked to him like a father, so it was said, and the bond between the two men had been strong. But for all his wisdom and alleged joy at the triumph of their forces, Owain struck Katlyn from where she was sitting in the front row as nervous. The muscles of his jaw flexed unceasingly, his mouth frowning as if he chewed something disagreeable to him. His fingers curled tightly around the stone hanging from his neck, and his eyes darted around as if he spied thieves in the crowd. Katlyn sat alongside Val, Chloe, Cody, Gunther, even Twenge, completing the row of Haille's comrades, all ready and willing to be called to defend him. Her eyes burned and her head hurt, for she had slept little the night before. Instead, she had stayed up, reading Corinthian law texts which Cody had borrowed from the castle library for her. Now her curiosity centered not on statutes, procedures, or addendums to laws, but rather the stone that so preoccupied the king. "Val, where did King Owain get that stone?" Katlyn asked. "A trophy, I heard. It was taken from one of the slain Morvant captains. His men presented it to him after the battle." "He prizes it, that is for certain," Chloe said from Val's far side. "Look how he touches it." "I noticed the same," Katlyn said. "Strange, isn't it? By all appearances, he seems to be a man who does not relish adornment. He wears no rings and a simple crown, yet that stone and its necklace are opulent." "Ostentatious," Chloe snorted. "As trophies of war often are," Val said with a shrug, his voice dismissive, as if he understood the ways of kings and warriors well. Chloe opened her mouth to offer a reply, but it never came. A guard hammered the floor with the end of his poleaxe, calling the room to attention. In the silence that followed, Katlyn could hear the chamber doors opening. Haile's appearance in the center of the room was preceded by his shuffling footsteps and the jangles of his chains, which ran from the shackles on his feet to the irons on his wrists. Val cursed under his breath when the prince walked into view. Chloe could not help covering her mouth with her hand. With her other, she took Katlyn's hand in a firm grip and did not let go. Haille was nearly unrecognizable. In the weeks since the battle for Karrith, since his father had died, Haille had shunned the world, including his friends and most meals. The time in the dungeon had only worsened things. His skin seemed to hang on his frame. His face was pinched, his eye sockets deep, and the cheeks beneath them hollow. His hair had grown long, his complexion pale, and his shoulders hunched. He did not look up to meet their eyes. Instead, his face was vacant. His gaze focused on some invisible point in the middle space between him and the dais that held Owain. "Do you understand the charges against you? That you conspired with the enemy in the betrayal and the murder of your own father, the king?" Owain asked, his voice reedy and thin. Haille mumbled something, his chains tinkling with his slight movement. Owain asked him to repeat himself. "I understand," Haille said. Owain continued. "As witnesses have reported, you rode into battle a creature, an elk, and it was these same creatures that broke through the lines of defense around King Talamar and slew him. Is there any part of this account that you dispute?" "No, my liege," Haille said. "Can you explain your association with these beasts?" Here was Haile's moment to defend himself, to proclaim his innocence and to dispute the interpretation of the facts against him. Katlyn rose to the edge of her seat and felt a tremor in Chloe's hand. But Haille did not stand erect. He did not raise his voice so that it could echo through the chambers. Instead, his voice was but a murmur. He shook his head as if confused, and attempted to wipe a bead of sweat from his temple, but his chains caught, and his hand stopped short. "I can only offer that the beast I knew was of a different nature, a different disposition from the others I saw on the field that day. Yet this one you rode has gone missing, like the other three. Do you feel that this implied collusion among their masters?" Owain rubbed the stone at his neck with his thumb. Katlyn could see Haille's throat flutter. "I do not know if these beasts have masters," was all he offered. "Do you claim that your own was tame?" Now it was Katlyn who swallowed a lump in her throat. How did one explain all that they had learned of Adamantus, the elves, the Vorgs, all the many fantastical things they had witnessed on their journey in the past months? Even in Karrith, where myths were told around campfires and with more fervor than in Antus, all Katlyn and her friends had seen would strain credulity. Haille was at a loss. Owain leaned forward. "Are you conspiring with the Morvant?" The room erupted into murmurs. Val's hand balled into a fist, and Chloe drew her own arm across him to keep him from rising up from his seat. Haille lifted his head for the first time, his eyes incredulous. "No, I came to aid my father." "Our messengers from Antus report that in previous weeks you had disappeared. Was this in order to liaise with Morvant spies?" Even the Corinthian nobles and army officers gasped with surprise at this accusation. Haille looked into the stands as if to beseech the crowd for help. Val shifted in his seat again. "Only Corinthians are allowed to testify," Chloe reminded him. "You will not help his case and only draw suspicion to us." "Suspicion be damned. Someone has to say something," Val said. "Someone is," Chloe said, pointing to a figure that had risen from the rows of stands across the chamber. She was a petite woman, but her posture was regal, her shoulders thrown back and her chin tilted upwards, with grace befitting her station. Queen Amberlyn's hair was silver, her face lined with age, but her eyes were bright and her footsteps swift as she came alongside Haille. Even Owain could not hide his surprise, his head tilting to the side and his fingers falling away from the stone that hung around his neck. "My lord, my king, and my beloved husband, I beg leniency for the prince. By what do we judge him, much less convict him? That he brought a contingent of reinforcements to help turn the tide of battle. The enemy rode horses. Our men rode horses. Does that place them on the same side, or call their loyalty into question? I think not."
"Hear, hear!" Val stomped his foot. "This city would be a burning ruin without the intercession of Prince Haille."
"Silence," Owain barked. "I will not have foreigners speaking in my court." Soldiers moved from the periphery towards Val, but he showed little sign of intimidation as he took his time to return to his seat, throwing challenging glares to his left and right. Katlyn's palm, where it rested in Chloe's, was slick with sweat. "This is highly unusual," Chloe whispered. "Owain, my lord, husband, my friend," Amberlyn implored, stepping towards the dais, one hand to her breast, the other outstretched towards Haille. "Is this the countenance of one who would commit regicide, patricide? We do not know what these creatures, these elk, are, but could it be allowed that they possess two natures? Much as men can be good or bad, so can animals." Owain's features softened as he looked upon his wife. Even the beginnings of a smile tugged at the corners of his mouth, his eyes brightening, as if the sight of his love cleared some of the rheumy haze that clouded them. But the reprieve was short-lived, for as he leaned forward, the blue stone shifted on his chest. His hand moved to settle it, and as he did so, his expression turned severe once more. "These are dangerous, uncertain times. Loss is heavy on all of our hearts. I do not forget my debt to Talamar, nor do I forget my duty to protect this kingdom, this realm. The nature of those beasts is a mystery, but frankly, so are the motives of this young man." He stared down at Haille, his hands twisting the chains that bound him. "I sentence you, Prince Haille, to exile. This is for your own safety and the safety of the realm, until more can be learned of our enemy and these beasts." A collective gasp rose from the stands, but it was the Queen's voice that cut through the clamor. "My lord husband!" But Owain cut Amberlyn off, his hand releasing the stone and chopping at the air between them. "That is enough. This session is at an end." Katlyn's sighs allowed her to squeeze through the crowds filling the courtroom, and those gathered outside under the bleak winter sun. She had left her cloak behind on the bench in her hurry, but the cold did not touch her, so hot she was with indignation, fury, even fear. She was well in front of Val, Chloe, and the others, having moved quickly to follow Haille as he was let out. She wedged herself between commoners lining the courtyard, awaiting news. Their curiosity was rewarded when 4 horses pulled up with a prison wagon with a heavy oak door and barred windows. Owain was wasting no time sending Haille away. It occurred to her that it was almost as if the verdict had been decided long beforehand. The trial was but a show. The sour smell of unwashed bodies, horse droppings, and wood smoke was thick around the pressing crowd. When she could not squeeze past adults, Katlyn did not hesitate to pinch their legs and even stomp their feet in order to make them budge. What could they do to her that would frighten her now? After all, she had faced soldiers, slavers, and vorgs. By the stars above, she had died once by all accounts. No, the reaction of these adults did not matter to her. Only Haille's fate did. So she was able to push to the fore just as Haille was led out of the keep to the waiting wagon. "Haille, this is madness! Worse than Haynes Point. We'll rescue you. We will.
Stand aside,
one of the soldiers shouted, pushing her back with the length of his spear held to her side. The jailers manning the wagon, tall men with knotted faces under black helmets, stepped down to take Haille. They pulled his chains so that he stumbled, but still he was able to turn to Katlyn and ask,
"Were we all such fools?"
She could only imagine that he meant Adamantus. The question weighed her heart like a stone anchor. She had been the one to release the elk in the first place, the one to trust him before all others. "No," she said. "He's different than those things. We'll find him and prove it." One of the two jailers yanked the chains, and Haille surged forward beyond her. Katlyn forgot herself, cursing and finally spitting on the closest of the two. It was a miscalculation, for he wasted no time weighing the merit of retaliating. He struck her jaw with the back of his hand. Katlyn fell backwards into the mud. Her vision was blurred, be it from tears or the blow, she was not sure. But as the jailers boarded the wagon and it began to roll away, her last impressions were seared into her mind. The blood on her hand as she lifted it from her lips, the clang of the wagon door slamming shut with such finality, the rattle of the chains, the obsidian sheen of horses' coats, the black of the jailer's armor, and the broken rings of gold that hung about their necks. Chapter 4. Amberlin.
"We've got to free him,"
Cody said, leaning across the table. Their party was gathered in the emptied servants' quarters below the manor house. Since the trial, they all had felt a certain vulnerability, even suspicion. Meeting in the cellar, like conspirators, followed naturally. At least there they could speak without worrying about spying eyes or ears. Even so, the hall was cold and dank. Her fury passed from earlier. Katlyn now sat huddled in a blanket while her friends debated, her swollen lip throbbing.
"That goes without saying. It's simply a matter of when and how. If we wish to ambush the jailer's wagon, it's best we let them move a bit farther from the city,"
Val said. "But what if we lose them?" Chloe asked.
"I have assets that are already following them," Twenge said. "They headed west along the sand road. It makes sense. The east is still uncertain as we don't know where the remnants of the Morvant have gone. South is open desert, and the Hand Sea is too dangerous to navigate this time of year."
"But exile doesn't necessarily have a convenient location. Oeon could be sending Haille anywhere," Cody said.
"Which is why Twenge has his men on it. I trust their tenacity, as someone who has had to work hard at shaking them off before," Val said.
Twenge nodded, and Katlyn detected a bit of pride in his face at Val's admission.
"Strange times, strange bedfellows," Cody said,
leaning back in his chair and slinging a leg over the arm.
"Strange indeed,"
Twenge echoed. "What is more important is to decide what danger we might be in," Chloe said, leaning forward.
"Chloe is right,"
Gunther said.
"If this is how Oeon treats his allies."
His voice trailed off, and he did not finish his sentence. He didn't need to.
"The appearance of those elk things and Adamantus' disappearance have not helped us," Val said. "That goes without saying."
Twenge slumped in his chair. The room went quiet, a heavy silence of disappointment, uncertainty, that was only broken by a banging on the door.
"I'll see who it is," Gunther said.
"Take your sword," Cody said, tapping his hilt.
"I have something better."
Gunther cracked his knuckles and rolled up his sleeves. Val let out a long breath and balanced his head on his hands, his elbows on the table.
"We don't know where they are taking Haille, yet, and we do not know if we are safe here. Probably not, so it might make sense to join up with Twenge's scouts sooner rather than later. After all, where Haille is going might be fortified. It might be best to strike on the road."
"All rise, in the name of the Queen," a voice shouted from the far end of the room where Gunther had appeared, looking flustered, while 3 figures followed behind him. Queen Amberlyn followed first, drawing the hood of her ivory cloak from her head. Her silver hair was plaited into 2 braids, one on either shoulder, and on her forehead she wore a simple circlet crown like her husband's. Behind her, the man who had spoken was dressed in the green cloak of a Corinthian ranger. Behind him, to Caitlyn's great surprise, was none other than Avenger Red. Red's hair was cut short like a boy, and she was dressed like a squire, but Caitlyn would recognize Gail Redmont, the woman who had effectively killed her with an arrow to her throat, anywhere. Only the power of the font of Jasmine had saved Caitlyn. Chair legs scraped the floor as the others rose to their feet. Caitlyn, without thinking, moved her hand from her throbbing lip to her neck. "Well met," the Queen said. "Please be at ease. I come as a friend."
"We are graced by your presence," Val offered, his jaw working, his eyes darting to Chloe and the others, then back to the Queen. Amberlyn moved to the seat at the head of the table and rested her folded hands on its surface. Gone was the confidence she had shown in the courtroom. She now frowned and hesitated, as if trying to find the right words. After wringing her hands, she finally spoke. "These are dark times." "Truly,"
Val said cautiously. Cody touched his thumb in a casual way to his belt, but Caitlyn knew he was, consciously or no, inching his hand towards his sword. It was a motion that was not lost on the ranger, who placed his hand on the hilt of his own sword, the blade clicking in the scabbard. "Dared, as you were. They mean us no harm," Amberlyn said. The ranger, Dared, removed his hand, but his scowl towards Cody remained. Red, for her part, hovered in the background, as if trying to hide in the shadows, her eyes averted.
"Cody."
Val only said his friend's name, but it was also an order. Cody shrugged, releasing the tension in his shoulders and letting his hands fall to his side. Amberlyn sighed. "It is a travesty what has happened to the prince."
"You mean the loss of his father? We agree,"
Val said. The Queen met his stare with resolve, her hands clutching the back of the chair. "No, I mean his treatment, his exile." "Yet it is the will of your husband," Chloe said tentatively. "Yes, my husband," Amberlyn said, wringing her hands again, her eyes roaming to the ceiling, the corners of the room, then back to them. "I plead with you for understanding. The events of the past months have been, to say the least, a strain. But I fear, and I speak this in confidence, that the king is not himself." Caitlyn recognized the danger of these words, even if spoken by the Queen herself. Openly questioning the king's judgment was sedition. Val perceived as much and rose his hand to stop Chloe from whatever she was about to say.
"Please explain further, Your Highness."
"If I may," Amberlyn said, pulling out the chair. Dared rushed to complete the motion for her. She invited the others to sit, and as they did, some of the tension in the room lessened, freeing the Queen's words to flow. "It has been since the day after the battle. The king has been different. He sleeps at odd hours and keeps up at long conversations at night, with whom I don't know, for he whispers to himself alone in his study. He has always been a gentleman, and a benevolent and attentive husband, but lately his views have grown paranoid, his judgments harsh."
"War has its strain,"
Val said. "No, it is more. I am his wife. I know. Suspicion grows while his trust diminishes," she said, her eyes gleaming. A pause followed. So long it was that even Red dared to look up. When Caitlyn met her eyes, they both looked away to different corners of the room.
"What is it you advise, Your Highness?"
Val said, his voice so low it was barely audible. "You must save Prince Haille. If the strain of war has been too great, the people will need a leader."
"Haille is only a young man, a prince, And with his father's death, the Anton Council is in control of Antus until they pick a new king or queen, Val said.
The Anton Council is far away, and the Corinthian Council, I'm afraid, is weak. I speak of Haille not as a military captain, but as a symbol of continuity, of hope. He saved the kingdom of Karrith with his actions. Aided by you, he may have even saved the realm of Anthor. Hope seems to be the one thing he has least of now, Katlyn said, the bitterness of her own voice surprising her. The Queen let her eyes rest on Katlyn. They were empty of reproach. Even if Katlyn had spoken out of turn, she had spoken the truth. The people need hope, Amberlin said. The Morvant have been driven back, but are they defeated? We don't know. And with those 4 elks on their side— 3, Katlyn corrected. She had overstepped herself, for even Chloe shot her a glare to silence her. But there was no restraining herself. Adamantus is on our side. I'm sure of it. Adamantus. That is the creature's name. That is our friend's name, yes, Katlyn said. You are bold in your certainty, the Queen said, addressing her directly, her opinion hidden behind a mask of formality.
Even if he still is our ally, his whereabouts are unknown since the battle, Val said, desperate to intervene. Amberlin turned her attention back to him. So we must find him. Derrid's squire, I understand, is an experienced tracker and is pledged to hunt down the beasts wherever they have gone. Derrid motioned Red forward, but she hesitated. His brow furrowed, as if vexed by the sudden absence of confidence on her part.
Alex, as an experienced tracker and expert bowman.
Bowwoman? Cody snorted. We've seen her work.
Alex, is that the name you go by now?
Val asked. Derrid's face turned red all the way to his ears as the Queen shifted in her seat. Is there a piece of this story I was not told? She asked.
There seems to be pieces of this story that even I have not been told,
Derrid stammered. Red dropped to her knee before the Queen in an effort to save him. The fault is mine, Your Highness. I have disguised my gender in order to serve the king.
Which one?
Val asked. The dead one, she answered, her gaze level.
The last time we met, you betrayed the prince, enslaved children, and even us, Val said.
Not to mention shot an arrow in my neck, Katlyn said, spit flying from her mouth. Now it was the Queen's turn to shade to Red. Derrid's expression was one of shock. Again, it was Red who bowed her head to beseech the Queen for her grace. I beg all of you for mercy. After you last saw me, I have been a loyal follower of King Talamar. I am no boy, not even a girl. I am a woman of 30 summers, despite my stature. I am stunted since I was a child. True, I used this for nefarious ends, to lure children into trusting me. Yes, I sold them into slavery. Yes, I betrayed you and the prince. I have committed wrongs I will never atone for. All I wanted when you saw me last in the mines was to be healed of my condition. But the font's power was spent. Since then, I have tried to make up for my wrongs. I have served the king and my master Derrid.
She speaks true. She saved Talamar's life in a skirmish with the Morvant. He trusted her himself. I have never had reason to doubt her loyalty or integrity,
Derrid said. Caitlyn's friends were silent until Gunther spoke.
Perhaps the fountain cured you of an affliction worse than your stature.
Red looked up. The motion caused a tear that had balanced on the end of her lashes to fall. Derrid placed a hand on her back. I am the Queen, and I walk the narrowest of paths, helping you while helping my husband. I cannot provide you material assistance on your journey, but I can send you to allies who will. You will have to decide among yourselves whether or not to trust this woman.
So you will help us to free Haille, Your Highness?
Val asked. I will. Meanwhile,
If you are convinced of this squire's transformation, we will send—" the Queen glanced to Red as if to ask her name. "Gail, Your Highness. Gail Redmond. We will send Gail to seek out the creatures."
"And what will you do when you find them?"
Val asked. "Kill them," she said, steel in her voice. "Not Adamantus," Katlyn said, standing.
"At least not immediately,"
Val said, his palm held out to Katlyn.
"First, we must ascertain whether he is for us or against us, and what his relations are to these other 3 elk."
"But even if she does find Adamantus, who's to say he'll trust her?" Katlyn asked.
"The young lady's right," Cody said. "Like you said, Capt, the last time we dealt with Red, we were the merchandise."
Val steepled his fingers beneath his chin and looked across the table to Katlyn.
"That is why Katlyn is going with her to find him."